You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is May 7th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website, and is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Horne, as we go around the Horn. First, we want to ask you about the African Union, CARICOM Summit, that will be held on September 7th, 2025 in Addis Ababa. Dr. Horne, are there any updates regarding this summit that our audience should be aware of?
There certainly are. What I need to stress to begin with is the fact that this summit will have high on the agenda the question of reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans. That is to say, the unlamented African slave trade, which in all its horrors helped to underdevelop an entire continent, not to mention having noxious effects in the Western Hemisphere, not least in the Caribbean and North America. What's interesting is that this historic summit between Caribbean nations, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc., and the 4 plus African nations is of historic profundity. And I would also attach and affix that label to the point that there are African Americans who are now mobilizing to attend this historic summit. Taking the lead, interestingly enough, are comrades and friends from the San Francisco Bay Area. They're organizing a major California delegation. But what strikes me is, where is the interest from New York City, for example, which I had thought was the intellectual and political leader of Black America? What about Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia? Will they be outstripped by Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco? Keep in mind as well that I've raised attendance with our Palestinian friends as well, and they should send, and they probably will send, a substantial delegation to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. They are just a hop, skip, and a jump away on the West Bank. And of course, they have a diplomatic delegation in Ethiopia in any case. And you can say the same for our other friends and comrades, be they the Brazilians, the Cubans, the Russians, the Chinese, etc. And given the fact that Palestinians are likely to attend this important summit, that underscores the point that we should invite and we should expect to attend many of our friends and comrades, particularly settler descendants from the Americas, particularly the United States of America, particularly our Latinx friends, our Asia Pacific friends, etc. And I think this kind of international solidarity is important because it not only will give jet propulsion to the question of reparations, I think you could say the same thing with regard to lobbying, with regard to sanctions against the Trump regime. Already there is an informal boycott in terms of tourists not coming to the United States from all over the world. There was an article in the New York Times the other day, and there have been repeated articles in Canadian media about European and Canadian shoppers seeking to boycott goods from the United States of America in a way to turn thumbs down on what Trump is doing, both domestically and globally. And I think that that kind of international solidarity is even more important, as the number of problems with all their complexity that we're facing are not going away anytime soon. And that brings me, of course, to the most pressing issue of the day, which is the standoff between two nuclear armed powers, speaking of India and Pakistan. This crisis was triggered by the fact that just a few days ago, 24 plus Indians were killed, slaughtered, in fact, in Kashmir, a contested territory that in many ways borders both Pakistan and India. There is an Indian Kashmir and a Pakistani Kashmir with a line of control, a border separating the two. And India has retaliated, although it appears that a number of their jet fighters were shot down, which may stay the hand of the Pakistanis, although they have pledged and promised that they will respond at a time of their choosing. And let us hope that they can be restrained. To dig a little deeper, I think it's fair to suggest that this crisis between these two nuclear armed powers in some ways is a legacy of not only British colonialism, but US imperialism. British colonialism, insofar as both Pakistan and India were colonized, as in the category being so-called British India, before August 15th, 1947, and with a malicious kind of cartography. When independence arose, you had India, a predominantly Hindu state, being bordered on the east and the west by Pakistan. That is to say, before the secession of what is now Bangladesh a half century ago from Pakistan, you had two predominantly Muslim states on each side of India, which was guaranteed to cause friction. I should also say that US imperialism is also implicated, not only because it has been suspected to be behind the dislodging of the former Prime Minister Imran Khan some months ago after he made a trip to Moscow, but also recall that in the 1970s, the United States, as a way to destabilize a left-leaning regime in Kabul, Afghanistan, began to whip up religious intensity in Pakistan. And in fact, that kind of religious intensity not only helped to spell the doom for the People's Democratic Party in Kabul, Afghanistan, chasing them out of power and bringing to power religious zealots, but you can draw a straight line from that gross interference in Afghan and Pakistani affairs, because many of the militants were in fact trained in Pakistan. Draw a straight line from there to September 11, 2001, and the attack on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. I think it's also fair to say that it leaves a dilemma in terms of who can be enlisted to mediate. We cannot necessarily call upon the Chinese because their relations with India are fraught, despite the fact that they're comrades in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Russia, as noted, had improved relations with Pakistan, but the aforementioned dislodging of the former Prime Minister Khan suggests that the military, which is the leading force in Islamabad, may not be too keen on seeing Russian mediation, particularly since Russia is one of India's closest comrades and has been since independence in August 1947. So I'm sure that the wiser heads in the international community will suggest that perhaps Brazil, a major force, a companion of India in the BRICS, can be enlisted, or perhaps our friends in Cuba, who quite wisely have positive diplomatic relations with virtually every country on planet Earth, except the United States of America, of course, and also has a very skilled diplomatic team, which helps to explain why they've been able to survive 90 miles away from reactionaries in South Florida since 1959.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the election in Australia. This past Saturday, May 3rd, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was re-elected in what has been referred to as a, quote, landslide victory for the center-left Labour Party. Albanese also becomes the first Prime Minister in decades to secure a second term. Albanese defeated opposition, the Conservative candidate leader Peter Dutton of the centre-right Liberal National Coalition, despite the fact that they were leading in the polls pre-Trump retaking the White House. Dutton also lost his seat in Dixon, Queensland, one he had held for 24 years. Dr. Horne, it appears to be a remarkable turnaround for the Labour Party and Albanese, whose popularity was at record lows at the start of the year. But Dr. Horne, how should we be analyzing the election in Australia?
It's the anti-Trump bump. We saw the anti-Trump bump a week ago or so when Mark Carney surged from behind with his Liberal Party and defeated the Tories, defeated the Conservatives. We see the anti-Trump bump again because Mr. Dutton and many of his friends and comrades have styled themselves as being the down under essence of MAGAdom, that is to say, make Australia great again. And it's also striking to note that the Conservatives sought to ape the MAGA forces in North America with all of this hyperbolic rhetoric about fighting wokeness and fighting diversity, equity, and inclusion and all the rest. But I think we in the United States need to take an even closer look than that, for example. What I mean is that Australia, Canada, and the United States are like cousins. All were formerly British colonies. Australia and Canada did not revolt against the crown, which is one of the reasons why King Charles III in London is still technically the head of state in Canada and Australia. And in fact, King Charles III will be giving the so-called throne speech, which is a rough equivalent of a State of the Union address, although his words are fed to him by the Prime Minister, in just a few days in Ottawa, Canada. I think that it's important for people in the United States when they try to understand how conservatives triumphed in the United States, but were defeated in cousin countries like Australia and Canada. You have to dig in to what distinguishes the United States from these two other nations. One, of course, is that despite the fact that all three are united in terms of the ferocity and the horrors of indigenous dispossession, it was only in the United States that engaged in mass enslavement of the Africans, creating an unpaid sector of gigantic proportions of the working class. And that issue is still being manipulated to this very day to the detriment of the working class as a whole. And secondly, something I mentioned before and needs to be mentioned repeatedly, which is that, as noted, the United States embarked on the road of republicanism, that is to say, anti-monarchy, replacing the so-called divine right of monarchs with the divine right of property men of European descent. And then in 200 years ago, during the so-called Jacksonian era, expanding the remit to encompass European men, generally speaking, for example, who then were able to benefit from the mass dispossession of the indigenous, starting in the southeast quadrant of North America in the state of Georgia, under then U.S. President Andrew Jackson, who was a favorite, I'm afraid to say, of Democrats and Republicans like Mr. Trump alike. So I think that when we begin to see these differences, perhaps we can understand better and more effectively why it is in the United States we are in the foothills of fascism, where apparently Canada and Australia are moving in a differing direction. All three have been afflicted by class collaboration that undergirds settler colonialism, be it in North America or down under. But it's the United States, as noted, which fractured the working class by embarking on this path of mass enslavement of Africans, which has created quite a political dilemma, to be sure. I should also say that even with this class collaboration that afflicts North America, we could have escaped that dilemma, but for the Red Scare. And that brings us back to Australia, because perhaps the leading figure of the Red Scare was a man who was well born in Melbourne, Australia. I'm speaking of the labor leader, Harry Bridges, led the San Francisco General Strike of 1934, organized West Coast Longshore, which is still a potent and powerful force from Seattle to San Diego. The United States repeatedly sought to deport him on allegations that he was a closet member of the Communist Party. The labor movement, speaking of the AFL-CIO, expelled his union from the House of Labor, despite the fact that his union was in the forefront of fighting racism on the docks, in the forefront of elevating Black workers. And sad to say, the NAACP jumped on this bandwagon and objectively supported unions that were contesting Mr. Bridges' union, despite the fact that these unions they were backing were white supremacists to the core. So there is a lot to be learned from analyzing Australia, and that particular examination obviously and inevitably brings us to an examination of the late, great Harry Bridges.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the Victory Day Parade, scheduled for this Friday, May 9th in Moscow, which celebrates the Allied forces' defeat of Nazi Germany. There's been a lot in the news this past week about who will and won't be in attendance. It has been reported that Chinese President Xi Jinping will be in attendance and arrived in Moscow today. On the other hand, there are also reports that two of Putin's allies in Europe, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, have recently fallen ill, and now it is unclear whether they will be in attendance. And it remains unclear whether President Trump will be in attendance. Dr. Horne, you have previously discussed how potentially pivotal Victory Day could be this year may be. Dr. Horne, why is Victory Day this year of particular significance?
It's of particular significance because it will allow for a mini summit, not only a summit between Presidents Putin and Xi, where they can continue to build bridges, continue to foil U.S. imperialism's diabolical plot to execute what's called a reverse Kissinger. That is to say, Mr. Kissinger helped to woo China a half century ago from the arms of the Soviet Union. And now the plot is to woo Moscow away from China, which I don't think will work, but we shall see, because obviously Mr. Trump is working overtime in that direction. It would not surprise me at all if Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, would be on the rostrum during Victory Day, which, by the way, is the holiest day on the Russian calendar, marking the victory over Nazi barbarism, which saved the planet from an even more horrible fate than it has endured over the last 80 years. I understand that the president of Cuba, Diaz-Canel, is also expected to be on the rostrum. And of course, he has received major and monumental support recently from both Russia and China, particularly China, which is helping to rescue Cuba's electricity system, which has led to repeated blackouts. What's remarkable as well, that Mr. Trump, who among other things is engaged in revisionist history, is trying to change the name of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, to something that he feels will reflect what he considers to be the contributions of the U.S., which is quite extraordinary, since we all know that Russia, the Soviet Union, lost tens of millions of its nationals during this conflict ending in 1945, and the United States lost about 400,000. We also know that this victory over fascism had enormous repercussions and ramifications worldwide. It's no accident, as historians like to say, that Jim Crow, a close cousin of Nazism, began to engage in a helter-skelter retreat post-1945, culminating with the U.S. Supreme Court decision in May 1954, suggesting that Jim Crow, believe it or not, was unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, as we've said repeatedly, the price of the ticket, the price for that victory was quite steep, because the United States demanded, the U.S. ruling class demanded, that tossed overboard as a result of this concession would be the leaders of the left, not only the aforementioned Harry Bridges, but his close friend Paul Robeson, and the Black left, in fact. And indeed, I'm afraid to say that this kind of maneuver was backed avidly, once again, by the NAACP, by the American Civil Liberties Union, by the AFL-CIO. In other words, the forces who are singing the blues, understandably, about the results of the November 2024 election, with 77 million people voting for the right wing, including a significant percentage of the working class of settler descendant origin. Somehow they don't connect their misdeeds of the 1950s and weakening the left and weakening a left influence on the working class. They don't connect that kind of maneuver they engaged in with what we are being afflicted with today. And that is also part of the lesson we should glean from Victory Day, which will be Friday, May 9th, 2025, the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Rwanda. According to the Washington Post, the Trump administration is also looking to Rwanda as yet another potential node in its developing human trafficking network. The Washington Post article went on to state that the Trump administration's efforts to significantly broaden the number of countries willing to accept people deported from the United States has found a welcoming partner in the African nation of Rwanda. Under the proposal, Rwanda would join a growing number of nations, including El Salvador, Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Libya, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea, that have agreed to receive deportees who are not their citizens. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news? The U.S. has a growing list of countries it is paying to engage in this state-sanctioned human trafficking enterprise, and the news that Rwanda has joined this list?
The bell tolls for thee. What I mean is, as Mr. Trump himself has suggested, these folks who will be deported ignominiously are not only those who are undocumented, don't necessarily carry a U.S. visa or a U.S. passport, but to use the term crafted by Mr. Trump, homegrowns, that is to say U.S. nationals who are deemed to be beyond the pale, as Mr. Trump and the Republicans see it, can also be sent to El Salvador or perhaps to Rwanda. What's interesting about Rwanda is that they had crafted a similar deal with the United Kingdom before Labour Party leader Keir Starmer came to power, and he jumped that particular accord. Although Rwanda decided to pocket the money that they had already received from the Conservatives, in my understanding, it might have been up to $1 billion. Now, according to recent press reports, both regimes in Libya, recall that as a result of what happened a decade and a half ago under Mr. Obama with the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya continues to be split with two regimes. And according to press reports, both regimes have denied that they will be receiving these folks who are about to be deported across the Atlantic. I'll be very surprised if Angola decides to receive these folks, despite the fact that the United States has been currying favor with Angola. Recall that the last foreign trip of 46 U.S. President Joseph R. Biden was precisely to that Southwest African nation. But it also reminds us that human trafficking is something that continues to this very day. Indeed, you can make an argument credibly that this country was built upon human trafficking, that is to say, the aforementioned unlimited African slave trade, which was human trafficking on a gross level. But it continues to this very day, with now the United States, instead of being on the receiving end, is on the deporting end or the exporting end. And of course, we will be rising up as one to preventing this outrage, in order to prevent this outrage from taking place.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about the ever-growing list of signs of open and notorious fascism in the U.S. For instance, this past Sunday, May 4th, during Trump's NBC interview, the NBC interviewer Kristen Welker asked President Trump if he is obliged to uphold the U.S. Constitution, and President Trump replied, quote, "I don't know." Trump also said that he has plans to hold several events to celebrate U.S. military victories this year, including a, quote, "big, beautiful military parade in Washington to commemorate Flag Day," which also happens to fall on his birthday. In addition, on April 28th, Trump issued yet another executive order, this one titled Strengthening and Unleashing America's Law Enforcement to Pursue Criminals and Protect Innocent Citizens. As the ominous unleashing in the title makes clear, Trump's newest executive order unleashes the cops and flirts with martial law. In fact, this past Thursday, Trump's border czar threatened to arrest Wisconsin Governor Evers based on claims that Evers' local immigration policies defy Trump's mass deportation agenda. Lastly, this past Sunday, Trump also announced a plan to impose 100% tariffs on foreign-made movies. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of all of this, and how worried should we be about the potential for all-out fascism in the U.S.?
Well, we should be ultra concerned. Not only was there a threat to arrest the Wisconsin governor, but there have also been threats to arrest judges. And in fact, a judge in Wisconsin was detained as she was leaving her courtroom on the allegation that supposedly she had helped the undocumented migrant to escape the clutches of the law. Indeed, the inflamed rhetoric coming from Macadam, coming from the Trump regime, also has not ruled out arresting and detaining, believe it or not, some U.S. Supreme Court justices. At the end of the day, I think that what we desperately need is not only a litany of these outrages that are leading us into the foothills of fascism. We need an analysis that helps us to understand how we reached this point after the propagandists of U.S. imperialism in courses taught in colleges and K through 12 from the Atlantic to the Pacific have told us that this great republic was constructed in the late 18th century with the rule of law, with the balance between the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branches, etc. Obviously, that threadbare analysis no longer holds water. We need a deeper analysis, an analysis that looks at the question of settler colonialism, looks at the question of class collaboration that undergirds settler colonialism. And I say this as well because we should also add to this growing litany the economic distress that has been brought on by so-called Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025. Leading ports in the United States are being described as being akin to ghost towns. UPS, which is a major competitor to FedEx and is unionized by the Teamsters, unlike FedEx, has laid off 20,000 workers, despite the fact that Teamster leader Sean O'Brien, during the Republican convention last year, bent the knee to the MAGA forces. And sad to say, with this growing economic distress in the United States, that will create further impetus and incentive for the right wing to respond by cracking down on the right to protest, by cracking down on civil liberties, and in fact, by seeking to distract the attention of some by accelerating this attack on the undocumented and those who support them. So obviously, we have a lot of work to do.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.